Not sure how to tackle your taxes? Are you sweating the small print? You may be experiencing FOMO, the fear of messing up. The answer? Using TurboTax on Intuit Credit Karma. They help you get your biggest refund, and then we help you do more with it, with a personalized plan designed to help you hit your money goals. It's time to take your taxes to the max. Start filing today in the Credit Karma app.
Hello and welcome to another Quiet Riot special, which today is looking at a medical condition that has blighted the lives of millions, including some of our listeners, but still remains misunderstood, underreported and utterly debilitating to countless patients around the world. I'm Kenny Campbell, and today I'll be looking at the condition known as long COVID. Before we start, our usual quick reminder that you can support our work by signing up for a few quid at ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. Supporters get access to our Discord channel, plus our live editorial and Ask Us Anything video events. And we love every one of our supporters dearly. It's exactly 6 years since the first COVID lockdown held us all captive in our own homes. At least 7 million people around the world were killed by the disease, and some estimates put that figure at 4 times their quoted level. COVID was always portrayed as being a matter of life and death, but even in the spring of 2020, it was becoming apparent that there was a third option, a COVID purgatory that sufferers quickly labelled long COVID. The NHS describes long COVID as what happens when the symptoms of COVID-19 last longer than 12 weeks. But this isn't just feeling a bit off for a while. Long COVID can involve chronic fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, breathlessness, heart issues, and neurological symptoms. Many patients experience something called post-exertional malaise, where even minor activities can trigger a serious relapse. In the UK alone, long COVID symptoms were adversely affecting the day-to-day activities of 1.5 million people as of 2024, according to the Office for National Statistics. Of that pretty substantial number, 381,000 people reported that their ability to undertake day-to-day activities had been, and I quote, limited a lot. Globally, well, the numbers are harder to pin down, which is often a sign that something big is being missed. A major review published in Nature Reviews Microbiology suggested that around 10 to 20% of people infected with COVID-19 develop longer-term symptoms. Now that, of course, translates into tens of millions of people worldwide. Economically, well, it's a slow burn crisis. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has warned that long COVID is contributing to long-term sickness absence from the workforce, while similar concerns have been raised in the US and across Europe as well. And yet, despite the scale, patients and campaigners argue that the response has been fragmented, underfunded, and in some cases, dismissive. Some have even described it as one of the great medical blind spots of our time. So today, we're going to try to cut through the noise. What does long COVID actually feel like? Why is it so difficult to diagnose and treat? And why, years after the pandemic, are so many patients still fighting to be taken seriously?
You didn't start a business just to keep the lights on. You're here to sell more today than yesterday. You're here to win. Lucky for you, Shopify built the best converting checkout on the planet. Like the just one tapping, ridiculously fast acting, sky-high sales stacking, champion of checkouts. That's the good stuff right there. So if your business is in it to win it, win with Shopify. Start your free trial today at shopify.com/win.
To help me navigate the choppy waters of long COVID, I'm joined by Claire Higham, who knows the condition both as a patient and as a campaigner. Claire, hello, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Hi, Kenny, and thank you for having me today too.
It's always a pleasure, Claire. Just to start simply, March is designated Long COVID Awareness Month. So, Claire, how do you explain long COVID to someone who's never heard of it or thinks it's just a lingering cold?
I would say that that's a poignant question, because actually a lot of people haven't heard of long COVID, even though it's a very common illness. Some figures and studies say that up to a third of people haven't heard of the term.
A third?
Yeah, it's surprisingly under the radar. But long COVID, it's actually a patient-derived term by Alessa Perigo, and it was a real moment in kind of patient advocacy, because patients recognised it really before the establishment did.
Right.
But long COVID is essentially any long-term symptom after a COVID infection. And this can be immediately after an infection, but we also have seen delayed onset as well, especially in the more kind of autoimmune aspects. But it's a hugely wide-ranging condition. So some studies have documented up to 200 symptoms, because it's just incredibly multifactorial, and it can affect any system in the body. So hair, skin, respiratory, GI, nervous system.
Oh, gosh. And how long before you're in the clear after you recover from COVID? In other words, how long can that delayed onset be?
The studies aren't hugely clear, but we have anecdotal evidence that it can be up to 3 months after an infection, that you can still trigger long COVID. And it's why I would say to anyone that resting after a COVID infection and during is really important, because exercise or doing too much can trigger long COVID.
In the early days of long COVID and of ME as well, that other debilitating disease, the advice given to patients was often to exercise their way back to health, wasn't it? Get out and do things. And it turned out to be the worst thing you can do.
It really did. And George Monbiot terms this as the greatest medical scandal of the 21st century. And he's not wrong, because, we had a disease that was accepted as neurological in the kind of 1950s. And then within 1970, we had 2 psychiatrists determine, without seeing anybody, that it was mass hysteria. And then we had basically in the 80s, it became, post-acute viral illness really became the domain of psychiatry. And it was seen that people were deconditioned and, weren't, they had a fear of exercise, and that had to be kind of cured by doing CBT and exercise.
Right.
And we still see the impact today of that in long COVID, as many clinics, and the advice is to exercise or to kind of rehabilitate. And it can be very damaging to do that, because pacing is, it's for anyone with post-exertional malaise, it's really, it's a dance with the devil, really.
Yes.
It's so dangerous.
And there's an element of this, there's a classic sexism element as well, isn't there? Because that claim that of mass hysteria wasn't that, if I recall, partly to do with the fact that there was quite a large number of women, quite a large proportion of women with the patients here. And it's almost one of those classic things where so-called experts go, well, it's women who are complaining, it's hysteria.
Absolutely. And we tend to think hysteria is something that, died in the 19th century with the Victorians, but it really, really hasn't. And yes, it was the Royal Free outbreak. There was an outbreak of ME in that hospital in the 1970s. We had, 2 men who'd never interviewed any of the women, and precisely because it was nurses who were affected, they were like, it's women, it's mass hysteria. 80% of people with ME are women, and it is it's a issue that is a feminist issue, and an issue that is, we still see it reeking of misogyny as well.
A depressingly familiar story, isn't it?
It really is.
Let's try to sort of dig under the surface a little bit then, and look at how it impacts individuals. Can you give us sort of a short version of your own experience, just enough to help people understand how this all plays out in real life? For example, can you explain just how difficult long COVID could make this interview for you physically and mentally?
Yeah, so to prepare for this interview, I've basically had to lie down in a dark room.
Everybody tells us that, but for different reasons, Claire.
And, and there will likely be impact for, the rest of the day and tomorrow, where I'll have to possibly continue lying in a dark room. And I am kind of led out prone at the moment, so I can, get enough blood to my brain.
Is it literally about getting blood to your brain?
Yes. So, one of the common consequences of long COVID is something called POTS. So it's called postural orthostatic tension, tachycardia syndrome, sorry.
Right.
You might get some instances of brain fog here. So, but yeah,
I'm with you.
It's where, you kind of you stop becoming an anti-gravity machine. So it's basically the blood in your head really wants to get to your feet, and your autonomic nervous system doesn't work properly. So a lot of people with long COVID and ME, basically you have cerebral hyperfusion, which is basically not enough blood is getting to your brain.
Is that because of your heart not performing properly, or is it purely a sort of a neurological issue to do with how the brain is functioning?
It's complex, I think. It's possibly both, but really, it's a neurological issue. And again, POTS mainly affects women too, and it often affects young girls. So I'm sure if it affected lots of middle-aged men, research would have, been there already. But again, a lot of the symptoms of POTS can be really conflated with anxiety. It's like racing heart, fainting, it's that kind of classic hysteric, picture. So it's very debilitating. Because, it's slightly like being, in the death zone on Mount Everest, where you're just not getting enough oxygen around, and especially into the brain.
Oh, my goodness me. And this presumably for a lot of people clashes with other sort of life challenges, menopause being the obvious one, I dare say, where symptoms on top of symptoms and everything starts to spiral. Yes,
it really does. And, I think with long COVID, it's an umbrella term. So there are other not well-known, this is a problem, other illnesses that kind of come with it. So POTS is one, and you have MCAS, which is mast cell activation syndrome, and you have ME, up to, there's quite a few studies saying that, people with long COVID, 50% meet ME criteria. And so really one of the issues, I think, with long COVID is that we just landed in a system that doesn't handle post-acute viral illness very well. We just landed in a system that wasn't ready on so many different levels that it's tricky.
When people hear us talk about fatigue, they'll often think tired, but that doesn't really scratch the surface, does it? I mean, what does long COVID fatigue actually feel like, and how is it different to feeling just really tired?
Yeah, I think, it's a good point you make, and it's a question of language, of nomenclature. It's that kind of, we don't really have the medical language for it. And I think when people say, you're fatigued, or you have malaise, or you have brain fog as well, these are all kind of terms that don't really give the pathology, and they don't really have the impact. So it's like, fatigue, it's a complex term, but it's also problematic because we had ME, the term became chronic fatigue syndrome, but that was led by a kind of psychiatric narrative. So, and it kind of minimizes the illness, and, it's not like fatigue where you're just tired after a long day, or it's not, we have CPET experiments showing that you can exercise one day and then somebody with ME and post-exertional malaise will exercise another day and the body hasn't recovered. And it's not like the fatigue with other conditions like MS or like Parkinson's, or, fatigue is in lots of illnesses like, cancer and all sorts of things. But post-exertional malaise is unique to ME, and a lot of people with long COVID have it as well.
So let's look at post-exertional malaise, because it's a bit of a mouthful. Let's just repeat it again, post-exertional malaise. But it's a key concept in the battle against long COVID, and it's a bit of a life changer in lots of ways, isn't it? Can you explain just a little bit more how post-exertional malaise changes how patients have to live their lives in really very basic ways, I suppose?
Completely. And, another term that some people prefer is post-exertional symptom exacerbation, because it's not it's not just a malaise or a fatigue. It's kind of an impact on any system in the body after too much exertion. So it's not just, sometimes it's fatigue, but for some people it will be, changes in body temperature, unable to control the body temperature. It can be your sensory system kind of overloads, and so light and sound is too much, or it can be your glands come up and feelings of cold and flu. It can be, it can be very unique to people as well. But I think what people don't realize is that it's not just physical exertion that is the problem. It can be, so I mentioned about POTS, it's orthostatic problems. So if you're upright for too long, that can trigger it. I have quite awful sensory issues, so light and sound are problematic as well. So too much light or too much sound can trigger post-exertional symptoms.
That's got to make your life a tiny bit challenging. Light and sound.
Yeah, I mean, actually at the moment we have builders in to put in soundproofing doors so I can manage sound better. Because
how does the sound affect you? Is it something that becomes painful or a distraction, or does it drain your energy? How does it manifest itself, this problem?
I would say at its worst, it can lead to, I would say, neurological collapse. I've had seizures because of it, and it's not physically painful, but it's like someone, shining a bright light in your eyes for too long. And it's, it feels like you're kind of going, it sounds a bit melodramatic, but it does feel like you're being tortured.
Right.
And your system just breaks down.
That's such a fascinating insight, because it's not long COVID isn't just like a really bad example of your laptop batteries running down and getting a bit old and not functioning properly. It's much, much more complex than that. The fatigue element of it then isn't just about you losing reserves of energy. It goes way, way beyond that.
It is. It's like a systems collapse is probably a better explanation of it. And I think what makes it difficult for patients is it often affects people's ability to socialize or to kind of interact with people. So, in its severe end, we have people that can't talk, that can't walk, that can't have a conversation, that, and it's a very fluctuating condition. So, for part of the day, you might have somebody who will be able to talk to you. And, for 90% of that day, they are not going to be able to see you.
Right.
And so people often say, oh, well, you spoke to, me for 5 minutes yesterday, surely you can do this, this and this. And that's not the case, because it fluctuates so much. Then people, it's very hard for people to really understand, and it's hard for people to, people get very isolated, and it's quite common for people with long COVID, and also with many disabilities, is that people drop away. So friends tend to drop away, family tends to drop away, because it's not because people are mean or they just don't know they don't have the language or the scaffolding to deal with somebody this ill.
It's something that we see when patients are being treated, even for very well-known diseases like cancer, where that difficulty in communication becomes an unfortunate barrier to people sort of maintaining contact. Mm-hmm. There's another challenge, I suppose, over and above that for people with long COVID, because, as you've said, so many of the symptoms are really quite hard to measure or even to see. You could be sitting in a room and you could be talking to somebody who is going through long COVID and the challenges it throws at them and not know anything about it. How much does that invisible element of the illness affect how seriously people like you and the hundreds of thousands of other patients in this country are being taken?
I think it does have impact. And I think, the term invisible illness, I don't think it's necessarily just that the illness is not visible to the naked eye. It's also because it's invisible to the medical system.
Right.
And I think it's because it doesn't have the validation really within medicine, then it's people don't often believe that it decreases the validation for people around you. So I think because there are more illnesses that don't have this stigma, then people will automatically, be empathetic or understand it. They have a framework and a network to understand other illnesses. But it isn't an illness where you kind of come out in a load of purple spots. It's but it's also, if you do know somebody with, especially moderate to severe long COVID and ME, it's quite visible as well, that you can, people have, people don't look right, they don't look well.
Yeah.
And it's the complexity, I think, it's the multi-system nature of it that really, completely baffles medicine. It's not really built that way.
It's why sort of talking to people like you is so important, though, in terms of raising awareness. I remember back in I suppose it must have been the early 90s when people still talked about yuppie flu. Yeah. And it was part of the sort of that period when ME was starting to break into the headlines. And I was training to be a journalist in Aberdeen. And the guy that trained me was a phenomenal fellow. And immensely hardworking, respected by everybody, even sort of our boss, who was a gruff northeast Scottish fellow who would sort of shout and grumble his way through the working day. But when this fellow who was training me had to take several months off work because he was diagnosed with ME, and that's what it took for people in the workplace to stop using the term yuppie flu, which really devalues the sort of or underplays, I should say, the importance and the impact that this family of really very debilitating diseases can have. If there's somebody who you know and you trust who is suffering and telling you just how bad this is, it's a good idea to pay attention to them, isn't it?
It really is. And, we often see within like the wider sphere, it usually takes some personal connection, even within politics or, in medicine, if somebody has a personal connection to somebody with, long COVID or ME, for them really to be triggered into action. But it is important to listen to people that have this condition. And again, we've talked about names and again, yuppie flu. And that comes from, like, again, within the 80s when it was really seen as a psychological illness. Yeah. And it was like type A, do too much, push yourself. And it was seen to be kind of linked up to a behavioural model, which is where the yuppie flu came from, really.
And that takes us on to the medical system itself quite neatly. From your perspective, Claire, where has the health system got some stuff right on this, and where do you think it's falling short?
Oh, that's a good question.
Take your time.
Yeah, I think the medical system, are we talking medical system or political system, or kind of both?
Well, let's start with the medical system. Okay. When you rock up to I'm assuming you can rock up to a doctor's with this sort of debilitation, but when you rock up to a medical expert and you start talking about your symptoms, in your experience, is the response, right, this is serious, we need to deal with this, we've got a handle on what's happening, we know where to start? Or is it much more a lottery where if you get the wrong medical expert, they're going, well, it might be psychological, or, do you know what, come back in a couple of weeks and tell me how you're feeling then?
I would say that, there have been like patient surveys on this, and most people do not have a good experience with medicine with this. And you will generally land in a hostile medical system. And I don't mean that people and doctors are going to be unkind to you. It's that there isn't a system there for you. And this is what kind of leads a lot towards dismissal and patient blame. So, say best circumstance, you get a doctor who's heard of it, you go to your GP, and, they might be able to empathise, they might be able to, listen to you. But usually then people will refer to a long COVID clinic, but a lot of those are shutting down now. So
really?
Yes, because what happened last year is that the NHS decided to put the responsibility onto ICBs, and for long COVID clinics, they weren't funded directly from the NHS. So that means that a lot of ICBs are now shutting them down. But what we had with long COVID clinics is that we had, because there isn't a medical specialism for post-acute illness, it's not like you'll go and see a consultant and then have like nurse care. What was built, and actually the UK was at the kind of cutting edge of setting up long COVID clinics, because Matt Hancock's wife had long COVID. Right. So there was a kind of initial push, and some of the political pushing has been quite good. But then what happened is you land in a medical system where you still had a lot of people who were influential in the cognitive behavioural model of ME, then build a system which was very based on what is called the biopsychosocial model.
Right.
So you had a demedicalized clinic system, which you would basically see a psychologist and a physio. So you're not really going to see a consultant. You're in a system that really was, it was. You might get a good practitioner. You might, and people do have them, a good specialist. We need clinics. And we need a good clinical system, but we're also in this kind of middle of this kind of paradigm shift where the medical culture and system is still pushing, in ME, we talked about ME. So in the 1980s, when you had GET and CBT, so it's graded exercise therapy, you would go to a multidisciplinary team, an MDT they're called, and you would see a psychologist, you would see a physio, and, you might see a nurse. So what has happened when you get long COVID, you'll go to a clinic and you'll see a physio, you'll see...
So it hasn't changed at all in that respect?
In some ways, it really hasn't. And a lot, because the NICE guidelines came in after a huge battle in 2021, where the guidelines for ME was changed, and exercise and CBT were like, no, this isn't good. We're going to drop them. But a lot of ME clinics, well, they're not even called ME clinics, they're called fatigue clinics, which says a lot in itself.
That it tells its own story, doesn't it?
But most don't have, most aren't NICE compliant. They don't comply to the NICE guidelines. And so you've still got this culture of people, and you've got a group called Back Me, and they still lead the push on clinics. And a lot of those people have influenced long COVID clinics. And we have, the society set up. A lot of people from Back Me went into the society. So
that's a campaign group, Back Me, is it?
It's a clinical body that guide clinical practice.
Gotcha.
Within the UK. So any change we try and make, change is happening. I really think we will get there. But, the medical system is a bit of an oil tanker,
Yeah, that's true.
It takes time to change.
I would love to hear a sort of a doctor's view in this as well. We do have doctors and nurses. We've got a lot of NHS people who listen to the show. Hello to all of you. And if anybody wants to talk to us about that, then hit me up on Blue Sky at Mr. Kenny Campbell. And if you've got any viewpoints, any feedback, I would love to hear it. Is there anybody in the medical system who's told you, Claire, why they consider it so difficult to diagnose and to treat long COVID?
Well, I think the main reason is there aren't any decent biomarkers. So there aren't any tests. Research is showing, some promise and things are coming through. But there isn't any kind of standardized testing, although you can, for something like POTS, there's something called the NASA lean test, which was actually given to astronauts, but it's where, it's a 10-minute test and you basically lean against a wall. And if you have POTS, you generally faint. Right. Quite obvious. So there are things doctors...
It's quite medieval sounding, but it works.
I mean, I've done it myself. It's very unpleasant, but it's...
Did you faint?
I did, actually, yes.
Oh, gosh.
But... and that was when after I'd been told by a consultant I didn't have POTS because he didn't really want to deal with it.
What was his reaction when you passed out? Do you remember?
No, I had to do it at home. I was under a specialist. I had to go private.
Oh.
Under a private doctor. And she asked me to do an acetylene test. So my poor husband had to be the person picking me up off the floor. But
God.
It was, sorry, I've forgotten the question.
Yeah, has the medical system or anybody in the system explained to you? The question was why it's so difficult to diagnose and treat, and you already touched on things that the fact that there are no decent markers in that respect. It's not unique. It's not like the medical system isn't familiar with other conditions, fibromyalgia, polymyalgia rheumatica. There are a family of very serious afflictions where the markers are either very poor or are not there at all. So it's not as if the health system has never come across conditions that are not easy to diagnose by box-ticking exercises.
Yeah, and I think it's this complexity in that it can affect so many systems. And it's also, and as you rightly say, there are many conditions that can be easily diagnosed without a diagnostic test. So like Parkinson's, or MS. Generally, it's because you have the research into the pathophysiology, then the doctors are more willing to kind of like diagnose it through discussion and talking and believing the patient. But like when you don't have that background, doctors are much more hesitant. And now, of course, we have the problem that nobody is testing for COVID. So it's even harder now to diagnose COVID because a lot of the infrastructure, and because the pandemic is really been pushed, to the side.
It's been normalised, hasn't it, COVID?
It's been normalised. And we are still in a pandemic. Who recognises that we're not in the kind of, emergency zone? But it's, COVID is still here. And people are still getting long COVID. There was actually a really decent study came out recently showing that long COVID numbers are not going down. They're staying high, and people are, and even like reinfection, it's still increases people's risk of getting long COVID on each infection. It's not really like, oh, I had COVID once, I was fine. The research doesn't show that. It actually shows that multiple hits of COVID on your system increases your chance of long COVID. So that we don't ventilate or, really, because of the culture of infection control didn't land in this country, people are still at risk of the condition. And it's not a condition you want, because the medical system is, it's not really there for you.
And that takes us on to the political angle then. You touched on it earlier. Is it fair to say that some of these issues go way beyond medicine and into politics and into history as well? I mean, in that respect, I'm thinking perhaps about the parallels with ME or chronic fatigue syndrome, the institutional skepticism that you've alluded to, and such like.
Yeah, there's definitely a political angle. So I think we saw in the COVID inquiry, Boris Johnson called long COVID bollocks, and it's like Gulf War syndrome. And like Gulf War syndrome was another one of these illnesses that a very prominent psychiatrist researched and decided it was kind of behavioural. And so not real, in kind of, inverted commas. Long COVID is not in any public health messaging. It was left out of the planning. The COVID inquiry has, really kind of demonstrated this. And even today, we see, the top tier, like the front bench, Streeting won't mention long COVID. It's a huge hot potato. To be fair, a lot of MPs on the backbench and in the APPGs are really pushing and wanting to help people with long COVID and ME. But, at the top level, it is because of the impact of what has to be done to solve it. We generally, because, when we had Freedom Day, didn't we? That kind of like motivation to get back to normal. And if we acknowledge long COVID and implement kind of infection control, this really counters that narrative. So because all the infrastructure was removed, so there's nobody's counting the numbers of long COVID. The ONS studies got stopped. There's no wastewater testing. There's no people generally don't test for COVID. So people are like, oh, I've got a cold, I've got flu, and it's like, if you don't know you've had COVID, then again, it's more difficult to go to your doctor and say, I've had COVID.
But the problem's not going away, as you say, and the impact on individuals doesn't get any less. In fact, it gets worse. The impact on society starts to grow. The financial impact that we've mentioned already grows. And simply putting our fingers in our ears isn't good enough, is it? I mean, the issue's there. It's a real problem, and it deserves real attention.
Economically, long COVID is a disaster, and I would say on a global level, and especially for the UK. And it's because, we had, 2 million people affected at the ONS, at the height. And it was like, it makes sense to deal with it economically, but like politically, the narrative and the liabilities that come from acknowledging that and we saw in the COVID inquiry that, they've said that infection control was wrong and focused on droplet transmission and not airborne. And obviously, if it's airborne, then institutions and government have a liability. And that's really probably is what at the heart of people not wanting to take it seriously.
One of the things about COVID is it doesn't give a damn who you are or where you come from, what your social background is, or how hardworking you are. In other words, COVID and long COVID take out amongst their victims a lot of very, very economically active people as well, don't they?
There's many different prevalence numbers, but it kind of evens out to about 10%. And if you think 10% of people, it might not sound very much, but it's a huge section of 10% of the population is a big number. And it mainly affects people, in the most people at risk are women in their 40s, actually. And that's another area where it is actually a feminist issue. And these are often women who are caring for children or caring for elderly people. And it's not just, it's the social economic cost as well of taking people out.
It is. I mean, it affects all age groups and it affects all demographics. But I saw the graphs, and it peaks at middle age, in your 40s, yes, and then the sort of second highest peak will be people in their 50s and early 60s as well. So it does seem to manifest itself or be picked up, perhaps.
And I would also say it's a real problem in children as well. And people don't think, because it was underplayed, that COVID doesn't affect children as much. The emphasis on long COVID affecting children was also neglected, and there haven't really been any public health warnings to parents or schools that your child is at risk, and they are in high risk environments because ventilation systems and infection control in schools has not been prioritized.
But if somebody contracts or develops long COVID at school age, presumably they're facing a lifetime sentence of having to deal with the symptoms.
The recovery rates for long COVID are not good. It's about 5 to 7% of people recover, and we do hear of people improving. Some people do recover. I mean, my daughter also has long COVID, and you are also faced with a world that doesn't take COVID seriously. And so we had our situation where every infection our daughter has had complications. So because the world isn't kind of adapted for infection control, we didn't take a Southeast Asian model, where masks were normalised or ventilation is normalised or staying home when you're sick,
Doing the basics, that's right.
Even doing those basics, testing, ventilation, even things like fire UVC, all of these things really, there was a real moment that we could have, as a country and a culture, gone, right, this isn't going to be the only pandemic. Nobody wants to get ill, even with flus or colds or anything like that. We could have really instigated a different viewpoint towards viruses and illness. We have very good public health systems with kind of food and water. We wouldn't expect to get any of these things from those aspects. But air, it's like there is a real stigma to it. And we've really missed an opportunity to normalise opening a window or staying home when you're sick. And obviously you need political workplace protections to do that. But because our culture is so based on presenteeism and, turning up when you're sick and all of those things, people don't realise that, and this is even before COVID, with people like ME, if you go out into the world with an infection, you can disable somebody. And, obviously you need the public health messaging around that, but there's an invisible impact that we don't often really recognise as a society. And I really think that needs to change.
Where are we when it comes to actually treating people, Claire? Are you aware of any promising avenues, or are patients still largely managing symptoms on their own?
Patients are largely managing symptoms on their own at the moment, but I would say there has been a lot of good, like privately funded studies and avenues and science. There's some really dedicated people in the scientific community that want to solve this. But I would really look to Germany, and it's decided to dedicate 50 million euros over the next decade as an intense research boost. And they've kind of termed it as the decade against post-infectious disease, and they're aiming to become a world leader. And again, it depends how that money is used, but there's looking to be some really promising signs that they understand the type of research that's needed. And so, but that's also what the UK needs to do. There needs to be this really, I don't know if you remember the Recover trial in the UK that kind of fast-track treatments for COVID for the acute phase. And they really found things really quickly, which is, one reason why the pandemic's impact have been lessened. But we need to do that for long COVID too. And that hasn't happened. We had 2 kind of research bids in the UK for about £30 million for long COVID. And most of that was wasted on lifestyle interventions or just research that has not impacted people's day-to-day lives, because they decided not to look at what was happening to try and really work out what was happening in the body, so what's called the pathophysiology. And there's the Rosetta study led by Danny Altman, but again, that's privately funded. And there's also Chris Ponting, who's just done Decode ME, a 5 million study into the genomics, and they're looking to do Sequence ME, which will include a cohort of people with long COVID. But that's, again, they've been declined funding, and they're trying to fund that for 20 million. And they've started the first stages. So there is, especially Ponting and Altman, there are these dedicated researchers, but they often don't get funded.
I mean, the irony being that COVID is the poster child for what happens when you throw expertise and money at an urgent problem.
Yes.
And if you mix in some political will and some profit motive and a planet which is absolutely terrified for its lives, things happen very quickly. Now, obviously, developing a vaccine is a different set of challenges. Particularly, they were dealing with coronavirus, which is not something that was brand new to us. But nevertheless, resourcing and taking seriously from a political perspective these sort of challenges is what makes the difference. If governments continue to treat long COVID as being a marginal issue, which they quite clearly are doing at the moment, what do you think the long-term consequences are, both for patients like yourself, but also for society more broadly?
If it's continued to be ignored, I think it's going to continue to have a really deep impact. And just on a personal level, I think most people know somebody with long COVID. And I think it's a little bit it's a lot like the climate crisis. We know it's there, we know the impact is massive, but especially political systems become paralyzed because the problem is so big, or they can't quite deal with the consequences. But I think for a workplace issue, for children at schools and their education, and it's a serious issue. And I think also what people don't tend to realize about COVID is that the long-term impacts aren't just like what we would term long COVID. It's also kind of, there's an increased risk of autoimmune illness. There's problems, with, cardiovascular, heart attacks, and there are also other like kidney issues or diabetes. That it's not just kind of this classic long COVID, it's also to do with mortality rates and morbidity. It's not good.
In the show notes, I'll put some links. You've provided already some very good links that people can visit if they want to find out a little bit more. Claire, if there was one thing that you wish people understood immediately about long COVID, what do you think that would be?
I think it would be people understanding the severity of the impact on people's day-to-day lives is serious.
Claire, it has been an absolute joy talking with you today, and I genuinely hope that we haven't drained your batteries too much, even though we now know that it's not just a case of draining batteries as well. I know that our listeners are going to be hugely appreciative of your insights. So thank you again so much, and our very best wishes to you and your daughter, who's also struggling with long COVID, and indeed your husband, who's having to cope with 2 long COVID patients. I hope everything goes very well for you in the future. Thank you once more.
Thank you, Kenny.
Thank you again to Claire for joining us today and talking us through long COVID in such illuminating detail. Also, if you heard any background noises such as phones going off or barking or the usual, that's because we let today's recording run uncut to minimise the impact on Claire. Long COVID is one of those stories that sits in a pretty uncomfortable space. It's not dramatic enough for headlines most of the time, but it is far too serious to ignore. Millions of people are living with it. Many can't work, can't function as they once did, and are navigating a system that still doesn't fully understand what is happening to them. If there's a theme running through everything we've discussed today, it's probably this, that uncertainty isn't the same as insignificance. Just because something is complex, because it's poorly understood, or because it's difficult to measure, doesn't mean it isn't real. History is littered with examples of conditions that were dismissed, minimised, or misunderstood before science caught up. The question, well, that's how long that takes, and how many people are left struggling in the meantime. If you want to know more about this gnarly topic, we'll pop some links in the show notes. And if you know someone with long COVID, talk to them about it, because it's not just the case that they're a bit tired all the time. The impacts are physical, they're mental, they're social, they're professional, they're emotional. They are very, very real impacts, and they affect a very significant number of people. That's it for this Quite Right special. Hit me up on Blue Sky if you've any comments. Just search for Mr. Kenny Campbell. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to join Alex, Naomi and myself for our regular Thursday and Sunday shows wherever you get your podcasts. Please tell your friends about us. Help us on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. And most importantly, keep listening and keep rioting ever so quietly. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Alex Andreo. Produced by me, Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canalou.
We've just kind of like put in blackout blinds and like soundproof doors. And it sounds a bit brutal, but it so helps. It's helped me just manage my symptoms better.
Do you know what else it's really going to help? It's going to help the quality of your podcast recordings.
Yeah.
You built a studio there and you're living in the studio. Well done, Claire. That's dedication.